Hi, welcome to episode 47 of the Woodwind Doubling channel. If you recall, episode 46 was bassoon on a budget, and I did it on the road while I was driving to work in Stratford, and I kind of liked the way it worked out. It gave me lots of time to talk about things and then fill in with the illustrations and video clips and stuff like that later. It was challenging to edit, but I thought let's do something similar for doing oboe and English horn on a budget. Here we go. Now, if you are already an oboist, man, have you gotten an advantage. Learning clarinet and saxophone, so comparatively easy. I mean, aside from stylistic considerations, technically easier to do in most people's opinion. So you get a big head start on that. Now, for those of us who want to play reed 3 books and who are coming at it from being single reed players, we've got a bit more of a challenge to get up against. And one of the first challenges, of course, is the expense. Double reeds just sort of goes hand in hand with expensive, it seems. We talked in the bassoon episode about some ways around that and some strategies. Fortunately, in playing oboe and English horn, there are some strategies for that too. Now, one disadvantage right out of the gate is that a bassoonist needs one instrument. So, you know, if you can find yourself a deal on one instrument, great, you're set. An oboist has to have an English horn. If you're playing on shows, you're going to see oboe and English horn. There's some show books that will be just oboe. In fact, there's also some show books that are just English horn. But the vast majority of times that you are playing oboe on a show book, you'll be playing English horn as well. And more to that, if you are playing oboe in any of the sort of traditionally popular Broadway-style musicals, you're going to be playing oboe, English horn, clarinet, and tenor. In some instances, there may be flute or piccolo or alto flute or some other saxophones added to that. Occasionally, you'll find it on an alto book, but the huge majority of times, it's going to be coupled with clarinet and tenor sax. Shows like Anything Goes and Guys and Dolls and Chorus Line, older shows like, I believe, Grand Hotel. All those things are just that standard array of horns for the third woodwind player. So, how do we get started in this? Well, like bassoon, oboe is a really good instrument to be studying with someone, and hopefully someone who understands, you know, the situation of a doubler. I find bassoonists sometimes are a little more easygoing about having students that aren't exclusively playing bassoon. Oboists, I don't know, they seem to be a little fussier about that. So definitely having a teacher is going to be very helpful in getting you going. That's also going to be helpful in terms of picking instruments and getting started with reeds. But let's start with instruments. Now, like with the bassoon, I've always thought that just buying an inexpensive student model to get started and then later on having to upgrade is not the best use of your money. So with that in mind, I would highly recommend looking at instruments that are going to be viable for playing in pit shows. Now, you are not going to go on, or likely not going to go on to be a symphonic oboist or oboe soloist, but you're still going to need pretty much all of the keys that you'd find on any professional model, like what they call full conservatory oboe. Now, there's a whole bunch of them that kind of get broken down, and various levels. You'll see oboes with what look like almost completely different key systems on them, but the essential fundamental fingerings are the same. Now, practically every oboe that I see going new these days will have such basic things as an F resonance key. That's pretty essential. You'll still find some older student instruments like that. Stay away from those. You also are really going to have to make sure that you get a left-hand F key. That's considered pretty essential. Oboe is weird in that it has different F fingerings. It's not just the first finger on the right hand like flute and like clarinet, upper register, and like saxophone. Oboe uses F sharp on that first finger. So that means that the F fingering is then done as either a forked fingering with the ring finger down, or like fingering an E and then putting the little sliver key down. It's sort of like the right hand equivalent of playing sliver key B flat or E flat on a clarinet, or you do it by playing E with the left hand F key depressed. It kind of looks like the left hand E flat A flat keys that are added onto clarinets or bass clarinets. So if you've spent a bit of time doing that, it kind of starts to make a little bit of sense. So that's one crucial thing. Got to have a left F key. Now, you'll find some oboes that are quite suitable for pit work that are missing one thing. They call it the split ring, or split ring D. And on a professional model oboe, it's kind of like it's used to enhance like one or two of the trills. And I've been able to do just fine without that. So that sort of falls into my category of it's part of a professional keywork layout, but it's not crucial. The left F far more important. Now, for example, one of my previous oboe that I played professionally before the one I have right now was a Fox Model 330, also known as the Bernard 330. We talked a lot about Fox's instruments, especially the synthetic instruments, in the bassoon episode, and they're right up there in terms of making excellent instruments that are either fully synthetic or partly synthetic. Now, oboists seem a little more amenable to a synthetic instrument because the bane of any oboist's existence is cracking, and it's having worked in a shop that specialized in oboes for a while, I can tell you that 90% of the cracks we saw were between the trill keys and the upper joint of the instrument. And by having an instrument that have a synthetic upper joint, at least, you never had that problem, of course. To me, it's kind of silly to me to have a synthetic upper joint and not go for the lower joint as well, but there are Fox and Leray models that are available with synthetic upper joints. The other thing that they'll often do is also lining the upper joint. They'll line it with hard rubber so that even if it cracks externally, the cracks won't go through the bore. So it's much easier to just patch those up. Sometimes it'll just be done with crazy glue, just filler in the cracks, since it doesn't penetrate the bore. So you've got a lot more choices in terms of viable synthetic instruments. With the bassoons, in my opinion, Fox is the one to go for synthetics. But in terms of synthetic oboes, you've got a lot more to choose from. Now, I played quite a while on a Fox 330, and they're excellent, and you can find them around quite easily. And price-wise, they might seem a little steep at first, but when you realize it's like, well, wait a minute, I could buy this for about $2,500 and then go out and do shows on it. That's a great deal. There are sort of student and advancing student model instruments from Yamaha and other companies like that fall into a similar price range, but actually don't quite have all the key work that you might want to have. Along with the left F, you'll often see references to a third octave key. Now, I don't see it as being so essential for a show player, but it's certainly one of those nice-to-have kind of features. Now, oboe is different from saxophones and clarinets in that we have three different standard octave venting things that we do. First of all, one is half-holing the first finger of the left hand, and that's used for playing C sharp, D, and E flat. And then we change over to the main octave key on the back, the one that's sort of in the same position as a saxophone octave key, and that is used from E up to G sharp. Then at that point we have a changeover to the second octave key there, and that's the one that's where we lean over with the first finger of the left hand. Now, that's the standard North American system. It's usually called a semi-automatic octave. You can keep the back octave key depressed, and when you press the front octave key, it changes over. It closes up the back key and switches over to the front. It can also be done by itself for leaps directly into the upper register. But by having it as a semi-automatic, it really facilitates not having to completely swap back and forth. Now that's going to be somewhat quite foreign to saxophone and clarinet players who are just used to pressing and going straight through. You will occasionally find, even in North America, some instruments that have been brought over from Europe that are what's called a fully automatic octave key system, where you just depress it and that's it. You don't need to worry about it, just like saxophone and clarinet. Now, while that would seem really appealing, and in fact sometimes you can maybe find those for a great deal, it's generally not the best idea. It's going to change some of your access for high note fingerings, so and it's also going to have a really awful resale value, because oboists traditionally in North America want to stick with the semi-automatic system. So whereas you might be able to get a good deal buying it, if you decided then that like oboe's not for you and you want to sell it, you could have a really hard time even just reselling it again. So I'd say stick with what's considered tried and true for North American players, and that's a semi-automatic system. Recommended brands in there. There's a lot of oboe brands now out there. A lot of really capable things. My best suggestion, if you want to go synthetic and have low maintenance, my number one pick for an oboe that you could really stick with full professional key work would be a Fox Model 300. A bit more expensive than the 330. But as a long range instrument, I'd certainly say it's excellent. Now, if you don't want to spend quite that much, and it's a little harder to find those ones too, go with the 330. There's also a Model 333. It's stripped down a little more. I would stick with the 330 as a good solid instrument that you could use as a very successful doubling instrument. But by all means, take a look at used instruments. If you are seeking out a teacher, they may have students who are moving on to another professional instrument. Sometimes a teacher will have, say, maybe an older professional model instrument like a Larray or something like that they want to sell off. Somewhat like with clarinets, classical players who work the instruments hard will feel that the instruments are losing a bit of resonance, getting, as they call it, blown out. But quite often for a doubler, those will work great, and you've got a lot of mileage left in them. So those are other possibilities when you're looking at it. One of my other things too is that sometimes if you're looking around and you take the time to do your homework, you'll actually find out that there's some older stencil model instruments that might get overlooked by other oboe players because they don't have the same brand recognition. Now, there's an excellent site that I've gone to and talked to the guy who runs it. His name is Peter Hurd, and his site is oboes.us. He has an excellent compilation of all the different stencil instruments and commentary on oboe makers, and there's tons of them. There's way more makers than I'd ever heard of. But there's several brands that you'll see that are respected ones too, that turned out to have 4 different makers on them. You'll occasionally see this one brand of instruments, and it turns out that at one time they were stenciled in France, then in Germany, then in Italy, and I think maybe even in Switzerland as well. That's Gourdet. You'll actually see those made by different companies all at different times. So sometimes if you find one of those, it can actually be quite nice, but you can check where it was made and check what company originally made them. Similarly with English horns, because some companies that made oboes wanted to have an English horn in their line as well, but they didn't actually want to tool up for it. So they would get a maker, quite often in France, to produce a stenciled instrument, which they could then put their own markings on. Case in point would be the English horn I have. It says Linton on it. It was actually made in France by Malern. Now, Malern, if you've ever played any of their clarinets or bass clarinet, you might not be so excited by the prospect of that name. But when it came to making English horns, they made pretty nice little English horn. And later on, their tooling was bought out by Marigot, who's one of the top-line professional oboe makers. And apparently the acoustical design and basic tooling is still the same thing that Malern was using in the 60s. Another interesting side point is that at one time Lauben used Malern bodies as the beginning for their English horn. They would do a little bit of reboring and tweaking the tone holes and things like that. But that was chosen as the starting point for those instruments. So again, you can often find some interesting deals that may not be known as well by other oboists. So it's certainly worth going to Peter's site and having a dig around and learning a lot of stuff there. He's a very interesting, very opinionated writer on oboes. So sometimes I know that I've had some personal experiences that may have differed with his experiences of an instrument, but he seems like a really open-minded guy, and he's like, okay, well, if that horn's good, it's good. He's whereas Lintons usually get trodden down. There's one particular Linton model that he writes about that he says was actually a really spectacular player, even though it was a kind of blingy-looking instrument. Budget-wise, for an oboe, I would say, you're going to be spending minimum $2,000 unless you find some spectacular deal on an older used Fox. Now, I find that pads on bassoons tend to hang in for quite a long time. Stuff on oboes is a lot more fussy. You really want to make sure that you're getting something that's ready to go or just needs a bit of adjusting. You don't want to have to go into an oboe technician and get a whole bunch of stuff done before you even get going on your instrument. So again, this is a good time to take a friend or teacher who's a full-time oboist to check out any instrument you want to buy, whether it's new or whether it's used. Even new instruments often require a little bit of setup and tweaking in that to get the most out of them. So I would again stay away from, say like Chinese branded instruments. You'll find some of the hard rubber ones around. There are some people who've been bringing them in and doing some setup work on those. I know that Jim Mason in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, is an oboist in the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony, a fine player, fine reed maker, and deals in used and new instruments. I believe he's been bringing in some oboes and English horns from China and then having them professionally set up and fine-tuned. So that could be worth a look. I would certainly not just buy them straight off of eBay. You definitely want to be, if you're going for that type of an instrument, you want to get them off of someone who really knows what they're doing and has taken the time to set them up. Yes, you're going to pay more for it, but the money you are paying is completely worth it. Reed-wise, there's a few ways to go. You're rarely going to find an oboist who buys anything off the shelf and plays it. Even the guys playing shows that I know, at the very least, they're going to be doing a lot of adjusting on their own reeds, maybe buying something commercial and then adjusting for themselves, or even buying from a reed maker who will do things kind of in bulk and get you something playable you can get started on, but then tweak it. I actually make my own oboe reeds, and I'll probably be doing a video on that in the future. I decided to get into that just because of the aspect of having control over what I was doing. I'd be kind of trying all sorts of different reeds, trying to find something that worked for me. And then once I finally found this sort of formula of cane to use and a cut and things like that, things started to fall into place. I understood much better how to control response and intonation and tone quality. And of course, that is the magical three things in the order. Always response, then intonation, then tone quality. Because if your note doesn't respond, you don't hear it. If your note responds, but it's out of tune, nobody wants to hear it. If your note responds and then it's in tune, then we can talk about whether it's in a suitable tone quality or not. But if the note doesn't come out, you're stuck. Response got to be number one. There are various schools around cuts of oboe reeds and things like that too. There is what's generally referred to as a European scrape and a North American scrape. Now I know there's different sub-genres within those, but generally in Europe we're talking about short scrape reeds, and generally in North America we're talking about longer scrape reeds. Now, Legere has a European scrape reed available right now, but it's very suited to a particularly European way of playing. A good friend of mine who's an oboist first and very good doubler, he described to me the European embouchure as being the smile and bite embouchure, where you just sort of pull back the corners of your mouth and smile, and you're putting a fair amount of pressure on the reed, and you also hold the instrument out a lot straighter from the body. North American players tend to use a little more relaxed embouchure, and the instrument comes in a bit. And if you try and play one of these European scrape reeds with a North American approach to it, you're not going to be successful. It's going to play very flat in the upper register. You're going to have trouble getting the notes to speak. If you approach it like a European player, you can actually be quite successful with it. I mean, the stuff that I've heard with some really good European players on the Leger reeds sounds excellent, and I'm really looking forward to when they get the North American scrape in reed done and ready, especially when they get the English horn reed coming out as well. That make life a lot easier. So what I do right now is I make my own oboe reeds. I've got a fair amount of blanks that I tied a few years ago that have been sitting, and they're very stable, and I'm lucky in that I can just pull them out and finish them from time to time. The process of doing that is fiddly and time-consuming, and it takes quite a while to sort of just start even getting a blank tied properly. So that's one of those times when you definitely want to have a teacher working with you. Now again, I did it the hard way. I just took a book one day and what I'd seen from other players and things like that, and I messed around and I learned, and I can make acceptable oboe reeds now. It's my way of learning things is not necessarily the best way for everyone. I tend to sort of read a few books and then just barge in and start doing things and see what I can do. And there's some things that take me a bit longer. I've talked about it before, that I probably could have been a lot better, a lot quicker if I'd done things in a different way, but hey, here I am now, and I can make reeds and I can do gigs on oboe and English horn. Now, on English horn, I haven't made any reeds for that ever. I've always started with reeds that I found when I was working for Gary Armstrong Woodwinds. We got in one of the very first Fox Renard 555 English horns, which incidentally is, I think, an excellent choice for someone doing shows with a fully synthetic English horn. You need to worry so little about things like cracking and just maintaining the instrument. Fantastic instrument for cold pits. It's a really good sounding instrument, responsive. So that's always been my number one. It's really the only choice as far as I'm concerned for a synthetic English horn, unless somebody's got like a sort of a tweaked in North America, hard rubber thing. But again, with the Fox Renard stuff, very, very reliable. But the very first one of these came in, and they always supply some sort of a reed with it. And Fox, formerly on their English horns, had put in these English horn reeds that were really kind of insipid and awful. And then one day this instrument arrives, and the reed was fantastic. It looked different from all the other ones we'd seen. It had this white wrapping on it. And I tried it, and Gary Armstrong tried it, and we said, geez, these are really nice English horn reeds. I wonder if Fox will tell us where they get them, or maybe they're selling some different ones now. So we phoned them up and said, well, who makes these English horn reeds? And they were nice enough to tell us that they were made by Stuart Dunkel. And we started ordering them from Dunkel's, and they were a hit. And I still play those on my English horn today. They're my favorite off-the-shelf English horn reed, either in a medium or a medium hard. And they last really well too. I mean, English horn reeds tend to last much better than oboe reeds just because you don't spend as much time playing it. So and the reeds are heavier, so they wear longer. So I wholeheartedly recommend those. There's probably some other good reeds out there too. One of the things I find with double reeds, especially like cane reeds as opposed to the synthetics, is that they can be very sensitive to elevation. If you're playing at high elevations as opposed to a low elevation, your reeds are going to have to be done a bit differently. And I'm not exactly sure whether it's just the atmospheric pressure or relative humidity, but they do respond differently. So if you're getting reeds from a maker, you might want to look at the elevation that they're at. Like here in Ontario, we're just at the level of the Great Lakes, so we're not that much higher than sea level. And in where I get them from with Dunkels, I think they're in Maryland, and so it's not like a crazy difference in elevation, and so the reeds perform quite well here. You'll also find some other private makers, things like that. There's an excellent double reed supply place, also in the Kitchener-Waterloo area of Ontario. It's called Blackwood Double Reed Supplies. And Katrina, who runs that, has a great stock of oboe reeds and English horn reeds from various pros around the area. Plus I know she carries the Dunkel English horn reeds, and it's a great place to just get general supplies and things like that. Because that's one of the things that once you start making or even just adjusting reeds, you're going to need some other accessories and things like that. You're going to have mandrels to hold the reeds. You're going to have plaques to go in between the blades of the reeds so you don't mistakenly chop off one side of the reed while you're working on the other side. You're going to need knives of various sorts and qualities, and sharpening equipment, and thread and wax, and it just goes on and on, it seems, at times. But a good double reed supplier can certainly help you put together a kit to at least adjust reeds to start with, and then later on suggest some things in terms of making reeds. Even when you make reeds too, you don't have to go in full bore to start with. You don't have to necessarily be splitting and gouging and shaping your own cane. You can buy cane that's already they call gouged and shaped and folded. So you basically just buy these little L-shaped pieces of canes, usually in bundles of 10, tie it onto a staple of your choice, and then you're at the stage where you're actually scraping and things like that. But like I said, we'll try and do a video that goes into a little bit more of the processes that I use in reed making, and see if that's a help for you. You can definitely start with a decent oboe and work for a while on that. I mean, it's going to take you a while just to get the oboe under control, and thinking about playing shows is going to take, there's a steep learning curve there. And, during that time, then you can start looking out for an English horn, so that when you actually have shows to play, you've got the English horn ready to go. Now, meanwhile, find yourself some other opportunities to play those. The episode that I did a few weeks ago, we were talking about community bands. Well, there's a great place to get yourself started in playing. It's so hard to find oboists in community bands, and even harder to find any that have an English horn. And there's some really nice stuff in the band repertoire, that oboe solos and English horn solos and things like that. The only complaint I have about band writers is they don't seem to know when to tacit the oboe and give them a rest. So you find a lot of crazy tutti passages and unisons and things like that. And one of my strategies has always been to just find the places you can duck out where it's covered and give yourself a rest, so you can save yourself for the big solos. But it's certainly very appreciated if you walk into a community band with an oboe and English horn case in hand, because they will find things for you to play. They'll be like, oh great, we can finally do this piece with its actual English horn solo, instead of like having it played by a cued saxophone part, or having oboe solos played by a trumpet and a straight mute or something like that. So yeah, there's places to go and play, and and even while you're developing, the community bands are quite welcoming of oftentimes of players of different levels and things like that. So that's always been one of my main places to go as a beginner and practice and learn things like that. It'll also get used to playing in flat keys, which can be a bit of a challenge on oboe and English horn. Now, one other note about English horn. I often describe English horn as being the fun instrument to play, and oboe as kind of the penance that you need to do before you get to play English horn. When you play saxophones, the general thing is that you start out an alto, and then later on you might add a soprano. And soprano, as a lot of saxophone players realize, is a bit more demanding. It's demanding in terms of intonation and control and things like that. And it's a similar comparison between the oboe and the English horn. The English horn is kind of easygoing, more relaxed, more forgiving, and the oboe is more demanding. So a lot of people, if they start playing oboe and get a little bit of a handle on it, then realize, well, gee, I'm going to have to get myself an English horn as well. And they're like, well, what's the differences in playing it? Is it a big adjustment? And my answer is usually it's just like, well, once you get used to the sort of difference in the hand span and the fact that there's a vocal on it, once you get used to that, it's like, wow, this is fun and easy compared to oboe. So, and I found quite often that, decent English horn reed, I can put it on there and get a would-be double reed player playing with a nice sound on that fairly quickly, whereas an oboe always seems to be fussy. So don't worry too much about the playing of the English horn itself. I find that as long as you've got a decent, well-adjusted horn and a decent reed, and you've spent the time on oboe getting used to that, all the fingerings transfer. There's going to be a couple little different, trill and resonance fingerings occasionally, but by and large they're designed to be played with the same fingerings, so you don't have to really worry there. There's going to be other bits in learning oboe technique and things like that. That'll take time, getting used to left and right hand alternates and things like that. If you've spent your time on clarinet, you'll understand, as you play left and right hand keys, there's duplication on either side, so that you can facilitate passages with certain notes consecutively without sliding. Similar kind of thing on oboe and English horn, although the way they're laid out, of course, is different than on the other instruments. There's a couple other things certainly you want to look for when you're getting an oboe. We mentioned split ring is optional, but it's nice to have. You definitely want to have the left F, but there's another key that I found that was missing from some of the other oboes that I've seen. Somebody I know bought an intermediate model buffet oboe, and played nicely, had a lined joint and all that, and had a left F, but it didn't have. There's a linkage in the left hand mechanism that lets you do an A flat B flat trill just by trilling your middle finger, and I see that as rather indispensable, especially not just show music but band music. I mean, band music, you play a lot of flat keys and you're going to see trills and nothing. Definitely an A flat B flat trill. You gotta have that. So those particular buffet instruments I wasn't really crazy about. I would probably avoid those ones myself. Nice idea, but that key, unless you had a good tech who could put it on, and if you got a really good deal on that instrument. Now, in terms of places to go look for instruments, obviously, I think that other than if you're buying like a plastic Fox or Renard, I would stay away from eBay. Those instruments I find so durable, and they keep their adjustment really well, that if I see a good deal, again, my rule of thumb, like in the bassoon thing, was if you can pay for it and then factor in the cost of an overhaul, and it's still a good deal, then that's something to consider. But obviously, being able to be there in person, shopping in person, is best for instruments always. There's a number of excellent dealers in the States. In the bassoon episode, we mentioned Charles Double Reed in New Hampshire, Midwest, and Forests. There's some other really good places as well. Mark Chudnow, RDG, I think Inaletti in Manhattan. So there's a lot of places like that are definitely worth looking for. Like if you're buying from one of the sort of established and trusted dealers around and dealing in oboes, you can do quite well there too. You'll be paying a slight premium, but you'll be assured of getting an instrument that's in as advertised condition and plays well. And occasionally you may find a real gem in an oboe that doesn't have as much name recognition, but is nevertheless a great player and a great doubling instrument. I wouldn't worry too much about matching my oboe and English horn. I know a lot of clarinet players who like to have their instruments matched up by brand, or saxophone players who like to play on the same brand of saxophones. I really wouldn't worry about it. With the oboe, find yourself something that works well for you, has all the keywork that you need, responds well, and the same thing for English horn. I mean, I don't find them as fussy that way. Now, you will occasionally find some keywork changes made on oboes. Sometimes you'll find a little first finger tab on the first finger right hand to help the reach. That's one of those places where people often say, yeah, that you've got to hook your finger up a little higher to reach that key, and so you'll see some tabs and things like that. Yeah, not a big deal, and you know, a good tech can certainly add those things for you. Mine doesn't have that little first finger tab, but if you look at some of the key work that's put out by Fox and Luray and other companies like that, you will see that there. Now, another thing to keep an eye out for on a perspective oboe, you definitely want it keyed down to a B flat. You will find some student instruments that are only keyed to a B. And even better if it's got a B flat resonance key on the bell. If you look at the bell and it's got just the one big pad on it, it doesn't have a resonance key. If you see the one big pad and on the other side of it there's a little pad that opens at the same time that one closes, that's a vent or resonance key that makes the low B flat sound a little nicer and clearer and not so kludged up. On English horn, you generally don't worry too much about the lowest notes, whether they've got a resonance key, but understand that the standard English horn that you'll see only goes down to a B. You would expect it to go to a B flat. It doesn't. There are some occasional bits in the repertoire that do that, and you may occasionally find some older European horns, especially made by some of the German companies, that will have that low B flat. And the reason that they've got it there is that Mahler wrote that note for them. But if you end up having to play Mahler, you can actually get an extension for an English horn to play those notes as a temporary thing for those pieces. Similar to the low A extensions that you can get for bassoon. Again, blame that one on Mahler. Wonderful orchestrator, but sometimes I think he had a bit of a loose hand with instrument ranges. Now, hand in hand with the advice on picking an instrument and getting started with reeds and things like that, obviously working with an experienced player and or a player teacher for that is all very, very highly recommended. But just a caution for people coming from single reeds, and I'd say especially clarinet players, you want to make sure that you keep your instrument setups on clarinet and tenor flexible and not too not too targeted. I see good jazz tenor players that have a lot of trouble doubling because they use too big a setup. It's too hard for them to make the switches between those. A good show setup, I find, especially if you're doubling oboe and English horn, is actually going to be, say like a 5-star or a 6. Like if you were playing an auto-link piece, I'd probably be playing a 6, maybe a 6-star maximum. And that's about a 90 or 95 tip opening. Whereas you find so many tenor players that are playing, 100, 110, 115, and playing higher baffled pieces. You want something that's going to be tonally flexible and speaks easily, so that you're not killing yourself when you make the changes between those instruments. Similarly, in the clarinet, if you're coming from a real classical background and you're playing like a very resistant kind of setup on that, you're going to have a bit more trouble doubling with the changes in resistance and things like that. So just make sure you have a look at those things. Keep them moderate so that you don't have a huge change to make when you go between those instruments. A couple other things that you might take a look at as well as you move into the world of double reeds. There are various supports and things like that for oboe and English horn. I find in a doubling situation, some are useful, some are not so useful. My friend Peter Voisey, who's playing English horn at the Reed 3 book on Guys and Dolls right now in Stratford, has an excellent setup on his English horn. It's a floor peg essentially. It's clamped around the bell. Now he had to make a special stand for it too because it's not collapsible. But basically it serves as a floor peg when he's playing English horn, bears the weight of the instrument. There are various other things. People will sometimes play those with a neck strap. There used to be a little assist thing that went around the thumb rest and sat on the chair. It was like a little peg that sat in the chair. I can't remember the name of the company now. I'll probably find it out and do a little overlay for you in the video. And they can be quite good if you're doing a lot of playing. You have to play, like if you're playing orchestral English horn, you could be sitting there playing English horn, for half an hour at a time. In a pit doubling situation, not so much. So I've generally gone with just playing the English horn in the hands, no extra supports, no pegs, no strap, and I found that that's worked fine for me. But if you need help with the hand support things there, just keep in mind it can slow down your instrument changes. The other things that you're going to have to be concerned about if you're getting into playing oboe and English horn is kind of strategy for looking after your reeds while you are playing. Most players will have a reed case out with several reeds ready to go, a soaker with a couple reeds that they're sort of using actively. You never want to be somewhere with just one reed that works. That's just asking for trouble. You always want to make sure that you've got several reeds in rotation. Right now, I've actually got 2 complete cases, 10 reeds a case, all pretty much ready to go or in process. I've usually got one reed case that's all performance reeds, and the other one that's sort of in readiness, or maybe some that are just sort of on their way out. But I keep a lot of reeds ready to go, and I keep several of them soaked. And you can't just leave them in the soaker all the time. Usually they'll end up with too big an opening, and that's a really crucial thing in oboe, controlling how much opening in terms of controlling high note responses. So it's constantly laborious. That's where using synthetics on your other instruments can really free you up. When I started doing chorus line last year, I was still using some of my cane reeds on my bassoon, but I was using plastic and everything else so that I could concentrate my energy on those, and that's what I do now. Next time I do a show on oboe and English horn, I'll definitely be keeping synthetics on the clarinet and the tenor so that I can focus my energies on fussing with reeds on the oboe and English horn reeds, because those are the instruments that really need that. So maybe not as extensive as our bassoon episode, but hopefully it's got some good information for single reed players who are looking to make a move and add oboe and English horn to their doubling palette. It's by no means exhaustive, but let me just say that if you decided you want to do this and you can put the money into it and make a go of it, it can be quite rewarding and quite enjoyable. I've certainly known people who've added it on later after they were already playing other professional instruments, and have been quite successful at it. If you've got a good methodical method of approaching your clarinet and saxophone playing, there's no reason why you can't add it. I've known people who've sort of tackled it and not really made it work, but I think it's been in those situations where there are people who tend to play a little more demanding setups on their clarinet and saxophone, and they've just found it really awkward to move back and forth and make those changes in the resistance and embouchure. So take that info and run with it, and thank you very much for watching, everyone. And as always, if you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please do so and hit the bell so you get notifications about when new videos come out. And I will see you next time on the Woodwind Doubling channel. Thanks very much for watching. Bye.